Welcome to Geowars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer: this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumps.
It's unlocked. December 1941. The Pacific Ocean is burning. The Imperial Japanese Army is moving like a tsunami across Asia. In a matter of weeks, the strongest fortresses fall. Hong Kong is crushed. Singapore surrenders. The Philippines collapses. The Japanese war machine seems unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. But on the southern coast of China, there is a tiny peninsula. It is no bigger than a few city blocks, a place of casinos and old churches. The Japanese army marches right up to its border gate. They have the guns. They have the men. They could take it in 10 minutes. But then, they stop. The soldiers stand at the Portas do Cerco, the border gate of Macau. They look at the green and red Portuguese flag waving in the wind, and they lower their rifles. While millions of people across Asia are falling under Japanese rule, this tiny city remains free. Why? Was it a mistake? Was it luck? Or was there a secret weapon protecting Macau? A weapon that didn't exist in China, or Japan, or even Europe. A weapon that was hidden on the other side of the world, in the jungles of Brazil. To understand this mystery, we have to look at the map of World War II differently. To understand how strange this was, you must understand the hunger of Japan. By 1941, Japan was desperate for resources. They needed oil, rubber, and steel to fuel their war against America. They were not in the mood for diplomacy, they were in the mood for conquest. Any territory owned by a European power was a target. The British colony of Hong Kong is only 60 kilometers away from Macau. When Japan attacked Hong Kong, the battle was brutal. British, Canadian, and Indian soldiers fought to the death. Civilians were captured. The city was turned into a prison. The Japanese wanted total control of the South China Sea. So logically, Macau should have been next. Macau was the oldest European settlement in Asia, owned by Portugal. It was a perfect harbor. It controlled the mouth of the Pearl River. Leaving it free was like leaving a door open in a burning house. It made no military sense to leave it alone. Yet, the order came from the highest levels of Tokyo: do not touch Macau. General Takashi Sakai, the conqueror of Hong Kong, was confused. Why should he spare this tiny Portuguese territory? Portugal was a weak country. It had no army in Asia to fight back. If Japan attacked, Macau would fall before lunch. The first layer of protection was diplomatic. Portugal, under the dictator Antonio Salazar, was officially neutral in World War II. They didn't side with Hitler, and they didn't side with Churchill. They played both sides to survive. But neutrality rarely stopped Japan. Japan had signed a pact with Germany and Italy. Technically, Portugal was closer to the Axis powers in ideology, but Japan didn't care about friendships. They attacked French Indochina, and France was technically under German control. So neutrality alone was not enough to save Macau. There had to be something else holding the Japanese back. The Japanese consul in Macau, Yasumasa Fukui, was sending reports to Tokyo. He described Macau not as a threat, but as a utility. If Japan conquered all of Asia, they would be isolated from the world. They needed a window, a place to talk to the enemy if needed, a place where money could move secretly. But the military commanders didn't care about windows. They wanted the land. They wanted to close the blockade on China. They prepared plans to invade. The troops were ready. The artillery was aimed. And then, a telegram arrived from the other side of the planet. This is the secret that history books often forget. The reason Macau survived wasn't in Asia. It was in South America. In the early 20th century, thousands of Japanese people had emigrated to Brazil. They went to work on coffee plantations, seeking a better life. By 1941, there were hundreds of thousands of Japanese immigrants living in Brazil. The Portuguese government realized they had leverage. Brazil was a former Portuguese colony. The two countries were brothers. They spoke the same language. They shared the same culture. And they shared intelligence. A message was quietly passed to the Japanese diplomats. The threat was never written in a public newspaper. It was whispered. If you touch Macau, Brazil will take revenge on your people. It was a terrifying prospect for the Japanese government. They cared deeply about their diaspora. If they invaded Macau, Brazil might round up the Japanese immigrants. They could seize their property, they could put them in camps. Or worse, they could deport them back to a war-torn Japan. The safety of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in Brazil was tied to the safety of Macau. It was a global hostage situation. Macau was the ransom. Because of this standoff, Macau became the strangest place on earth. While bombs fell on Hong Kong and Shanghai, the lights in Macau stayed on. The casinos were open. The restaurants served wine. It became the Casablanca of the Orient, a neutral zone where everyone could meet. Refugees flooded into the city, rich merchants from Hong Kong fleeing the Japanese, British spies pretending to be drunk tourists, Japanese officers looking for information, Chinese resistance fighters hiding weapons in rice sacks. They all walked the same narrow streets. You could sit in a cafe in Macau and see a Japanese officer at one table and a British intelligence agent at the next. They would glare at each other, but they wouldn't shoot, because the peace of Macau was too valuable to break. The city became a hub of secrets. Gold was smuggled in and out of the harbor. Information about American airstrikes was sold for bags of rice. The British consul, John Pownall Reeves, became a legendary figure. He operated out of a small office, helping thousands of refugees. He was a thorn in the side of the Japanese, but they couldn't touch him. But don't mistake peace for safety. Japan couldn't invade with tanks, so they invaded with fear. They surrounded Macau on the water. They controlled the food supply. They told the Portuguese governor, "You are free, but we decide if you eat." The Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, started operating inside Macau. They didn't wear uniforms, they wore suits. They kidnapped Chinese resistance fighters from their beds. People disappeared in the middle of the night. The Portuguese police were too weak to stop them. The governor of Macau, Gabriel Teixeira, had the hardest job in the world. He had to smile at the Japanese generals who threatened to kill him. He had to bow to their demands to survive. When the Japanese demanded to search houses, he had to agree. He was buying time with his dignity. The tension reached a breaking point in 1943. The Japanese were losing the war in the Pacific. They were becoming paranoid. They demanded that Macau expel the British consul. They threatened to cut off all rice shipments. The people of Macau began to starve. This was the darkest chapter of the story. Japan didn't need bullets to kill Macau. They used hunger. They blocked the Pearl River. No ships could enter without permission. The population of Macau had tripled due to refugees. There was no food. People started dying on the streets. The casinos were empty. The gold was gone. The beautiful European buildings looked down on a city of skeletons. The Portuguese government tried to buy rice, but Japan blocked the shipments. It is estimated that thousands died of starvation during this neutral period. Cannibalism was rumored in the darkest alleys. The protection of Brazil could save the city from invasion, but it couldn't save it from famine. Japan was squeezing the life out of Macau, waiting for it to surrender. They wanted the Portuguese to beg for occupation, but the Portuguese held on. The Japanese patience finally ran out. They decided that the British influence in Macau had to end. They couldn't invade, but they could remove the problem surgically. They targeted the British consul's staff. The shadow war turned violent. On the streets of Macau, Japanese agents attacked British officials. There were shootouts in broad daylight. The Portuguese police stood by, helpless. The Japanese installed a Japanese advisor to the governor. In reality, this advisor was the new ruler. Macau became a protectorate in all but name. The Japanese flag flew next to the Portuguese flag. Japanese soldiers walked the streets as inspectors. Technically, they hadn't invaded, but practically, they owned the city. The Brazil threat prevented a massacre, but it didn't prevent control. Japan found a loophole. They didn't conquer the land, they conquered the government. The governor was forced to sign over Japanese demands. Macau had fallen without a single shot being fired by an invading army. Then came the confusion of war. The Americans began bombing Japanese positions in China. To the American pilots flying overhead, Macau looked suspicious. They saw ships in the harbor. They assumed they were Japanese. They didn't know about the delicate diplomatic dance. U.S. Navy planes attacked Macau. They bombed the hangar of the Naval Aviation Center. They strafed the harbor. The Portuguese were furious. They were neutral. They waved their flags at the sky, screaming for the Americans to stop. Japan used this as propaganda. Look, they said, the Americans are killing you. We are your protectors. It was a twisted irony. The country starving Macau claimed to be its savior. The country fighting Japan was bombing it. But the bombing also brought a strange relief. It showed that the war was ending. The Japanese grip was loosening. They were retreating across the Pacific. The soldiers at the border gate looked tired. They looked scared. August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Japan. The emperor surrendered. The Japanese war machine, which had terrified half the globe, shut down overnight. In Macau, the Japanese advisors quietly packed their bags. The Kempeitai burned their documents and vanished. The British Navy sailed into the harbor to accept the Japanese surrender, but when they arrived, the Portuguese flag was still flying. Macau was the only European colony in East Asia that was never formally occupied. Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore had fallen. Shanghai had fallen. But the tiny peninsula had survived. The Japanese commander in the region formally surrendered. The nightmare was over. Refugees opened the warehouses. Rice returned. The spies went home. The casinos slowly turned their lights back on. But the city was changed forever. It had survived, but at a terrible cost. The secret of Brazil had worked, but barely. It proved that in geopolitics, a hostage on the other side of the world can be worth more than an army at the gates. Today, when you walk through Macau, you see the ruins of St. Paul's. You see the old fortresses. But you won't see many monuments to the non-invasion. It is a quiet victory. A victory won in shadows, by diplomats and spies. History often remembers the great battles, D-Day, Stalingrad, Iwo Jima. But sometimes, the most fascinating stories are about the battles that never happened. The invasion that was stopped by a whisper. The tiny city that stared down the dragon and lived. This is GeoSecrets Unlocked. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden corners of history. We'll see you in the next file.